Okay, so we should be live. I'm just going to check YouTube to make sure that we are.
I like the mountain in the background.
That is Queen Med Mountain. How come we're not live on fucking YouTube? Oh, we are live, but I don't see. Oh, there we are. Okay, I got it now. So, don't give me 1 second. Let's see if we can get this right. If anyone is joining us on Facebook and YouTube. Why am I talking back to myself? Okay.
How does it work? Where are you broadcast? Where does it stream to in YouTube?
It is streaming on Facebook and it's streaming on. See if I can get this right here. Admin approved your post. That's not it. Reload. I don't see it come up on Facebook. How come? Yeah, it's a new kind of software I'm using. Well, it's not a new software, but it's new to me.
Something must be working. You have a comment there.
Oh, I have a comment already. Oh. Where does that come up? Can you see that comment? You can?
Yeah.
We usually have this kind of run of a thing where we start figuring stuff out while we're doing it at the same time, while we're live. You would think that we would have done. Right, that's. Are you reading that comment on Facebook or YouTube?
No, I'm in Restream. Isn't that what you sent the link for?
Oh, I see it. Chat. Oh my God, I love you both. Well, that's interesting. That's a good start of any podcast.
Yeah, great.
Please keep your comments coming. More like that, please. Not quite sure why it isn't. I'm sorry now if anyone has just tuned in. Just not sure exactly why it isn't showing up on Facebook. Maybe we won't have to worry about Facebook tonight, and we'll come back to it another time.
It's a YouTube comment.
Oh, all right. So basically,
So you must be live on YouTube there, all right?
okay, we'll stick with Facebook. Or sorry, YouTube. But I'm not seeing it come up on that place. Okay. Damn it. Wrong one I want to. There we are. Tell him it's a YouTube comment. Dylan, it's a YouTube comment. Oh, actually, that person's telling you to tell me.
Yeah.
It's me, Nightmare, by the way. Yeah, I take Nightmare, right. He's a traveller lad. I say a smart lad, but you might think it's meant as in smart comedy, but it's not. Anyhow, we'll figure this stuff out over the next several years. Anyone who is watching or has just tuned in, welcome to Outside the Colony. This is my first and Dylan's first live on YouTube, technically on YouTube, streaming through YouTube for the first time in 3 years, 4 years. And most of our talks prior were all to do with history, colonization. That hasn't changed all that much. But I think in more recent times, we really have gotten our act together. We know exactly what we're talking about now. So disregard all the previous stuff. We got our shit together. Um, we had recently given a talk in Portlaoise, Fort Protector, that Dylan's going to tell us about in a minute. And basically, it was at Minefield, and it was at the organizational hands of Martin Beans Ward, the stand-up comedian, and sometimes he does it when he's sitting down too. Also, so he's pretty multitask comedian. And also, we had a wonderful host on. I was calling her Alfie. Her name is not Alfie. It's Aoife Grace Moore, wonderful human being, journalist, I think with BBC, but also she is from Derry, which for me made the talk all that bit more friendlier, opened, because sometimes it's difficult to talk to people that, come from the same bubble as yourself and then talk about colonization and settled identity and institutions and all that kind of fun stuff. Dylan was telling me on the last day that he walked 11,000 steps. Dylan, would you like to tell us more about that? Was it one step at a time, or did you hop it?
That was just to get to the Portaloos.
You were hopping against the Portaloos. Oh my! Oh yeah, it was quite a distance, wasn't it?
It was a lot more than 11,000. That's tiny.
That was on the last day, was it?
20 odd thousand, easy.
Wow.
So the electric picnic is great. It's like grueling fun. I call it. Yeah. So it's grueling, but it's fun as well. Like, but it's not easy going, is it?
Yeah, my daughter was a bit like, "What? Electric picnic?" Like, obviously reminding me that I'm old. But we weren't there for the party. But nevertheless, the music venues were brilliant. For the 3 nights we were there, we most certainly every night we turned up outside the Jamaican music. Um, Dylan was informing me a lot of that stuff too, and the Irish connections, and it was brilliant. Overall, I really enjoyed it. As a traveller, I struggled. I'm not ashamed to say it. My tent was going all different directions. Um, and the what you call it? Oh, can't even pronounce it now. Can't forget the name of it. But the
Fly
crap,
sheet.
without the what?
Fly sheet.
Without the call of fly sheet. We have a
The
different
fly
name.
sheet. The outer part of the tent. Yeah.
Yeah, that was a bit maybe too short, so I was flapping it more so.
Yeah.
And then it was quite windy also. It was it felt like the Wizard of Oz, Dorothy. That was going to blow away, end up in Kansas or something. But overall, I did enjoy it. Of course, it's like one of those things when you finished it, you probably enjoyed it a bit more. But there was a lot of walking involved. Dear God. And then I got lost 300 times. So that didn't help either. Dylan, how did you feel it? Were you tired when you got back? Did you sleep for a week?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the ironies will be I probably went to bed earlier there than I do at home.
Well, this is
I
it
was
too.
probably healthier. I was living a healthier life at the electric picnic than I was here. That's a fact.
Interesting.
Yeah, I'd be better off doing that more often. You know.
Well, take up the life
But,
of
it's fascinating. It's fascinating to see something that big. I haven't been there in years. I was at it before, but it was 16 years ago, and that's a long time, I guess, by anyone's standards. So I was like a novice again in some ways, but also I'd seen it when it kind of was near the beginning of it. I guess a few years into it. Now, it's similar, but it's a lot bigger, a lot more packed now. I mean, it's overwhelming almost, isn't it? At first,
Oh, my first time there anyway. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Just massive.
Yeah, and stuff everywhere. But we got around a lot of it, didn't we? We managed to find the those strange little places down in the woods. We found the drum and bass, the sound systems, the tent where there were, the giant tent worshiping the I don't know what you'd call it, rave, I suppose. Or I know the genres, but that was just mad.
No, I think overall it was definitely a good experience. And I think because we're two old people, it was like a bucket list. We wanted to get in and see as much as possible because we might not be back there again. Who knows? A comment is asking, can I ask you, did you think people received the information you both give? Was it positive? I don't know. What do you think, Dylan?
Yeah, I think overall, if there was negative, people kept it to themselves mostly. One or two people were a bit maybe slightly confused, but I think or one maybe wasn't processing it too well. but nothing hostile as such. You know what I mean? Nothing serious, and a lot of people who were pleased. I mean, in the sense they said, actually, that makes more sense. Compared to the way the history is a bit in our heads, the way we learn it, that it was more straightforward to understand. I think the same comments were made to you, weren't they?
Yeah, I actually 3 or 4 people that come up, and it was very much like that. That makes more sense. Or else it was, I always knew that. I always thought that. I was like, yeah, I'm right.
Yeah, yeah. So confirming for some people what's actually more or less common, it would seem like more or less common sense. But it would not. Yeah, but before it would not be said by people generally. You'd be left confused, wouldn't you?
Yeah,
You
I
know.
think it's one of those things. Once it's said and put into context, to a certain degree, anyway, it just makes more sense. So it goes to show that what's out there at the moment wasn't probably making sense. Because as we often say that this narrative isn't new. It isn't something that one day me and Dylan decide, oh wow, let's make up a story. Let's invent genetics while we're at it, and let's do the whole microbiome. No, all that was in existence. It was take a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and then bringing it together. So, again, it make it sound like we just did it overnight. You're talking about at least 10 years of working that kind of stuff out, or at least to solidify it, to make it solid, create a foundation, then create a framework, and then give the context. So it wasn't an easy journey by no means. We could make I don't know if we make it sound any easier now, but getting to this point was not fun. Um, but nevertheless, and that was another thing that I really liked about the electric picnic of in Fort Protector, is that there was a very strong anti-colonial vibe to it, and a very pro-Palestine, which is anti-colonialism in itself. Um, what's that band's name? I should be ashamed of myself. Kneecap. Um, they're definitely bringing a
You
whole
were
new.
you were up front, weren't you, in the mosh pit?
I was up close. I was getting a few recordings. I thought it was great doing all these recordings till you started reminding me that actually, copyright issues. What are you going to do with them? Where are you going to go with them? But I'm sure there's clips I can use at least over time.
Well, it wasn't me so much as Fatboy Slim. It was on the giant screen, wasn't it? Put away your
I didn't
camera.
see that part.
Hmm?
I didn't see that part. Was that on the Fatboy Slim video?
You read it out yourself. It said, "Put away your cameras and enjoy
Oh
the
yeah,
show."
oh no, they meant by put away your cameras and enjoy the moment.
Yeah, exactly. But they don't want you recording it. That's the point.
Oh yeah. Oh, gotcha. Okay, fair enough. I just read it as put down your cameras, enjoy this magical moment with Fatboy Slim.
Well, that's what it's put as, but also they don't want the show being recorded, so you put it up on YouTube later on. You know, that kind of way. It's all a copyright thing. That
Yeah.
I don't think Kneecap's too worried. They're not the same kind of show. Have you seen footage of that? It was the whole place went down to that 80,000 people. So to see headline, rap in Irish, headlining, well, it was 3:30 in the day, but basically headlining the main stage on
Oh, right.
it was some sight to behold, wasn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that was one of the first open concerts I've ever been at. You know, 50 years old, and I'm at the Kneecap. So I couldn't have asked anyone for a better
Good
musical
start.
event. Brilliant start because it's all to do with as we know, anti-colonization. But it's brilliant that young people like that are talking about it because it makes a broader awareness, and then it makes me and you not sound as insane when we're talking about history and ancient history and all kinds of history because it's very much relevant in the present. And I suppose that's one of the main things we've been doing over the years is to say that we're not trying to school somebody or educate somebody on what happened 500 years ago. We're trying to point out that some of the problems that exist in the present are a result of something that happened 50 years ago, 100 years ago, or 500 years ago. So if it began, started, continued, and exists, it's worth talking about. And it's also very, very, very psychologically healing. I think knowing for another word for knowledge, having that knowledge is knowing of something. And then you can choose not to know about it. You can say, okay, I don't want to know about it. But at least you'll know you don't want to know about it. which is still knowledge. So either way, it's all good. But yeah, I think there was. I don't know. We'll go into the talk because there was like one of those things. I think when you come away from it, I always feel that there's a million other things I would like to have said or would have said. But I think it was smooth enough. And as you said, the people weren't alien to it. They weren't reacting bad to it. There was a lot of nice facial expressions to it, like kind of relief. That's brilliant. But there
Oh, really? I,
was one tricky question at the end, and I went over my head. And the way it was framed, and I should have known better. Listen to George Lakoff about framing. It was how it was framed, and it was something like, okay, but what about the positives? So when someone says, what about the positives? It almost suggests that we were talking something negative. But you were pretty quick to catch that. Do you want to talk about that for a moment?
um,
Is it Epicurus? Epicurus? Is that the guy?
oh yeah, Epicurean. Yeah. Well, I was saying, well, that's what you mentioned a second ago, which is like, what would be the motivation? Why would we talk about things? Not just in the past. Well, everything's in the past, but why? As you said, doesn't matter if it's 50 or 500 years. Uh, Behind all of that is always a motivation, as you know. To the reason you would do it, it would be. I was saying about it. Well, for the as you said, it's what you call healing, or it's like if you know why something happened, it's easier to deal with to some extent. If you know why it happened or how it happened. Actually, if you know how it happened or how something was built or why it happened, there's nothing worse than uncertainty. Basically, it's a lot of what fear and stuff is based on. Like horror movies, everything, isn't it? It's always uncertainty. It's the what's worse is the dark, or what you don't know what's out there. And it's the same with when you're stuck under probably systems and systems of power and oppression and things like that are on purpose or opaque. They don't explain where they came from or how they got built. They try to pretend that it's always been that way. That's just the way it is. That's how the world is. Don't you worry about it. And so it's one of the ideas of history to to use that a large word, elucidate or make clear, to shine light on the how these things came to be, and to make them, and then you can kind of say, well, okay, I know how it was built. Maybe I can do something. Maybe it's not personal. Maybe it's stuck right in the past, and then everybody's forgotten how it came to be this way, if you know what I mean. And of course, that's yours motivation. We know that that's a kind of philosophy guiding history. And I think I mentioned at the talk as well, as you said, Epicurus. The Greeks had an idea about science, for example. They called it, they had two concepts. They had the idea, they were the ones inventing Western science. And then they also would have been also faced with the question, well, why do this? What's the point? Why are you getting into this stuff? This is just making life harder, more complex, or, you know what I mean? It was easier when we believed the gods just did it, or whatever. And they would say, well, it's pro-ataraxia, which is for the removal of pain, if you know what I mean, would be the highest thing, that people were living in fear in their time, that people lived in fear of the gods. They lived in fear of uncertainty. They thought the gods could just do anything, and at any moment they could strike you down. People got ill. It was the gods who were out to get you. You must have done something wrong. This kind of thing. It was
very little you could do about that.
The normal beliefs.
You're meant to accept it, aren't you?
Yeah, the normal beliefs of people throughout time, of course, and superstitions and things like this. But some of them are good, but a lot of them are would put fear in people. And of course, they'd be used by people who would say, well, I know what the gods want. I know why they struck you down. I know, this kind of stuff. And people would have to be in fear of them. And they might set themselves up as kings and rule or whatever, because of people's superstitions and all the rest. So, yeah, they had this idea that why would you do, that scientific inquiry and historical inquiry was always had to be guided by something, because you could use it also for evil purposes if you had knowledge. You could use it to gain advantage of people and that kind of thing. So they had the idea that in Epicurean schools and other schools of philosophy that you used, that it was always aimed, that it was ethical That it was always aimed towards. It was ethical as long as it was aimed towards removing people's pain in the present moment. That's all. That's why you would do science. That if people understood that actually the sun was out there and was a star, it wasn't actually a god or whatever, that they would be less fearful. And the less fearful they were, the more relieved of pain, in a sense, they were. Actually, sorry, I've gone off on one down there.
No, we're not.
Well, basically, you have to have a moral compass when you're doing these things, don't you? You have to have a guiding line because of some knowledge of why you're doing it. And like you said, that question was one of them ones that's like almost philosophical level, a Jedi kind of attack on what you're doing. Because when someone says, after the end of a talk like that, and someone says, well, okay, that's all very well, but what about the positives? What about the positive aspects? As if
it could also be. Can you hear me there? You can?
Yeah.
Okay. It could also be maybe a kind of a reaction. It's kind of like overwhelming, a bit scared by it. Because I went on a bit about how none of the colonial systems had changed, and the Irish education system by default is more Westminster English than it is Irish, which is King's Inn in Dublin. And I'm not sure if that person had a legal background or not. So maybe it was kind of reactionary, thinking this is negative. I don't like this. Where's the positives? And the positives were in the negatives, unfortunately.
Well, all of us, me included, you can mistake when something's difficult or weird to you. You might mistake it for being negative. You might call it negative. On the other hand, I would think that a question like that is more clever than that. That it's not just a reaction. It might be on one level, but it's not just that, because that idea of like, okay, yeah, that's all very well, but what about the positives? Just means that everything you've said, basically, it's implying that everything you've said, what you're dealing with are negatives, and as if what we're doing is negative. And so you have to push back on that, because you have to say, well, as I think, I can't remember exactly what I said at the time, but I was trying to say that I just would pick up on that, because you have to like push that back, because you have to say, well, look, people have to be not afraid to look at the past. They have to not be afraid to look at difficult things. You have to make it that it's safe to do so, but you also can't turn away from it and declare that it's negative. It's not always negative to look at things that were difficult. It's like trauma in anyone's life or something. You kind of have, well, not everyone always has to do it, but you kind of, in general, if you want to get over it, you have to like face it at some level,
Yeah, I think
same for the country, isn't it?
I think some experts believe or say, I think that to overcome trauma, you have to be also exposed to the trauma, because to overcome it, you have to talk about it, which can be traumatizing. Now, in honestly extreme cases, and you can't do anything about it, well, then you might accept, I know that I don't want to know. I don't need to go through all them details. There's very little I can do about it. But as we keep tying the past into the present, and why it's very relevant to not just for travelers anymore, it's pretty much for the whole island, if not beyond the shores of Ireland, that understanding the machines, the origins of machines, their purposes, why they were designed, would help us understand them, how to operate them better in the present. Wouldn't that be beyond line what we're talking about?
Yeah, that would be our intention. You can see also from a question like that where someone says, what they said was, and I should be more clear, is that they had said that, well, that's all very well, but what about the positives? What about cases where someone had become a traveler person, had become a barrister or something like this? That was the idea, wasn't it? Actually, a friend of mine, Ruth there, who I think you know as well, would have said they get that a lot. They would see that in things to do with disability studies and stuff like that, where and sometimes people will say that as if it's a positive. What about this person? This person became a professor, or this person, came from that community and became such and such. But those exceptions don't. That's great for them, but those exceptions don't change anything. Well, firstly, it's on whose terms. How much did they have to change themselves to be accepted in that world? Because they haven't changed that world. The criteria for becoming a barrister is the same, I would assume. They have to conform to that world. So, and as you know, I remember talks we were at before a long time ago where travelers would feel they had to hide the aspects of their culture in order to get on in the settled world. And is that the criteria for success? How much do you fit in with the settled people? Oh, sure. What about this person? They became this. And of course, as as we also know, without changing the system to be more accommodating, or to be more broad in its terms, an isolated case of success is great for one person, and I'm delighted for them. But it's not that doesn't mean, we know from statistics that like most people aren't getting there, and that the system still discriminates against most people in these situations. So I wouldn't hold that up as some kind of, that's not positive compared to what we're talking about. We're talking about changing the system so that everyone gets an equal shot, or at least some.
System should be changed in a way that to say something like that would be kind of silly. It'd be like, of course, why wouldn't they be barristers if they want to be? What's stopping them? But the fact that there's so many obstacles, and then the few that do get through, it's almost like a reward system that you too can do this if you conform, I suppose. Remember, there's Aldef Ray Jr. We had on a podcast a couple of years ago, last year, whatever it was. And he said something quite interesting. He said, even in African Americans in America, that opportunity equality comes along. But what they end up doing is replicating the very same system that was oppressing them. So now you've got a rich black people, you've got a middle class black people, and you've got the poor black people. That's like I don't know, the equivalent to saying the rich person with disability, the middle class person with the disability, and the poor people with the disability, the rich traveler, middle class traveler, poor traveler. It's the system that we are talking about. We're not talking about stripping it down, breaking it down, getting rid of it. We're talking about tweaking it, slight changes, and that again becomes knowing about the system.
I think the person maybe had misunderstood what we were aiming at there. All right, I would definitely say that, in the sense that they probably didn't understand that we were turning the point of view, we're shining the light back on the system itself. That it's the source of the discrimination, obviously, if you know what I mean. And therefore, you have to sort of, as you say, tweak that. You have to change some of the little rules in that, or broaden its definitions of what's normal, is the way we would put it, isn't it? And then you say, well, other cultures in the country are normal as well, including obviously travelers, and indigenous cultures, by definition, should be normal in the country they come from, you know. But that's not the case when the system's been built in a colonial manner. So you need to shine a light on that. You can't. The question was asked in a way where we don't need to change system. It's the old-fashioned thing. We don't need to change system. What we need to do is hold up. What about this person here who managed to conform to the system and become a success? Aren't they great? Well, it's good. It's okay that happens for an individual. An individual is strong enough to do it, but it doesn't change the inherent discrimination in the system. If you know what I mean, it doesn't have any effect on it. You know, as you said, it just recreates. It starts to recreate. What it does is assimilation. It starts to recreate the discrimination, but now within the community that, you know, as you say, African Americans, as Adolph Reed had talked about, where you ended up with middle class African Americans running, I suppose, the equivalent of NGOs, and getting accused then of keeping their own people down. This kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's unfortunate, but it is all systematic. And when you factor in that David Lloyd George had told these guys in the early 1920s that nobody's changing anything, like not literally one system could be changed. You know, the royal institutions, legal system, education system. So if none of them changed, everybody had to conform to the systems.
Yeah, not just that it wasn't changed. They actually had changed some of it already, because there was things called Doyle courts in the 1919 to, some expert will tell me, but 1922 roughly. They had courts had sprung up in the country called Doyle courts for the Doyle elected in 1918, 1919.
When was that?
1918, 19.
Oh yeah, but David Lloyd George threat didn't come till afterwards, didn't it?
Yes, exactly. So afterward, exactly. I'm just going to make one tiny point, which is to say that it's even worse than just that they kept everything the same. It's actually more. They went further than that. What they said was the Dáil courts have been in operation since the time that Sinn Féin got elected in 1918, I think, were overwhelmingly returned to Parliament at that time. And then what happened was they set up their own Dáil, illegally under British law in the country, right? That's the beginning of that's like the revolution in action, you know? They set up a parallel administration in the country. Okay? Refused to go to Westminster and set up a Dáil here. Okay? And part of that was they boycotted all the British institutions. And then what sprung up, especially along the West Coast, is a very great interest along the West Coast in particular, were things called Dáil courts, which were courts run by under the new Dáil, essentially. But they were underground because technically there was now two systems in the country, the Dáil and the British. original system, if you want to put it that way. And so they passed a lot of judgments, and then some of them included things like where they were going to pass. They were allowed to include, for example, they were allowed to, if the Brehon law had a better precedent than English or common law, they would they could use that in judgments, like in disputes or whatever. So in some cases, I believe they did, and they started to incorporate. So this is our point: would start to incorporate laws that would have widened the definition of what was normal, if you want to put it that way, not just on British standards, but on Irish or older standards like Gaelic standards, of what was normal. And they started to the law started gradually to change a little bit in these Dáil courts. And actually, a lot of people were going to them. Even and this is funny actually almost, but British landlords and that would turn up at Dáil courts.
Yeah, you're talking about before.
Trying to get disputes done and all the rest of it. And as you point out,
the English one is a very rigid system, isn't it? It's right down the middle, guilty, not guilty. Where the Brehon one was more negotiable, I suppose. Or
so these courts were doing the same thing, though. They were still common law courts or whatever, but they were allowed to contemplate widening, to make a decision saying, well, okay, the Brehon law would have done X, Y, Z. It's actually, we think that's more fair than the common law, therefore we'll use that. And it would have gradually changed the law in the country towards heading towards a more Gaelic system. But what's interesting about it, again, what you're saying, my point really was, by 1923 in that treaty, not only did they say you have to keep the law that was the British law, they expressly wrote it into the thing in the treaty agreement that all Dáil courts law, everything passed between 1918 and 1923 by the Dáil courts was null and void, rolled back. So they rolled it back in time and said all the law that was standing before the Dáil was the Dáil was composed in 1918 or 1919. That was, they had to bring it back to that point before that. So it was all just English law, if you know what I mean. And they eliminated all of the stuff that had happened during the actual revolution. So that shows you that it wasn't just keep things as they were. It had to be returned exactly to the situation when the British were still in control of the situation, if you know what I mean.
The treaty was more like a legal binding contract than anything else. Stating this cannot be and this will be, and that's the way it's going to be. And fast forward. I have a quick question here for you. It's in the comments. I have a question for Dylan. From my understanding, there have been at least two splits between travellers and settled. The first split was shortly after colonization started in the 11th century, and the second was around Cromwell. I'm up to date with Bernard's regarding colonization and the microbiome study. So my question would be, in your opinion, is my understanding correct? Or would we believe the government version, the split happened just from Cromwell? Just to say it briefly, I don't think it's necessarily the government's version. It's something that popped up in the Cavieira's report where the word split had been mentioned 17 times. He's not about divergence, but split was mentioned 17 times. And I think, again, I know I'm answering this and I shouldn't be, I'll give over to Dylan just to frame it. It's not necessarily the splits, it's the genetic markers that shows up. So there's the genetic split 360 to 420 years ago, probably a bit longer. Then there was an older one, which goes back 1,000 plus years, could be 2,000 years. But they're genetic markers, not necessarily a genetic split. And I'll let Dylan answer the rest. I think we know why. It was actually, you did mention to me, Dylan, that actually it would make sense that there would be a genetic marker also almost slightly separated from the rest of the Gaelic society if there were Gaelic clans marrying into powerful Gaelic clans and inner marriages.
I can't say that I. First thing I'm going to say is that we don't know. We don't know all the answers to that stuff. The genetics are pointing at something which is of interest in history, but I can't say exactly. We haven't done a thorough study to explain all of that. From what I understand, though, it's not a split. It's not the first one is not so much a split. They're saying that there was some division between the traveling community and the settled community in the 17th, 16th century. That's showing up, no problem, and it shows us what they would call a split as such. Really, it's we would say it's really probably the breaking down of clan structures and the isolations between them that would have existed, if you know what I mean. In other words, they're only intermarrying in certain groups. A lot of groups in the country, you can see that they were confined to their provinces, for example. There's some genetic markers amongst the settled population that they're, in Munster, Connacht or Connacht, Ulster or Ulster. There's some indications of that from people who've lived there for generations. Travellers show a slightly different pattern, split between north and south. So northern half of the country, southern half of the country are in two large groups, but not confined to provinces as such, which makes sense because they move a little further or wider.
Go back for a moment slightly to the settled people. Obviously, before the 16th century, many of these people, our people, settled people, would have shared the same gene pool, many of them from the same clans, same families.
They're all
And
coming
these-
from the same, by definition, they're all Irish names, so they're all coming from the same gene pool at some point. Yeah.
Yeah, but the genetic markers, again, which I will find interesting. And it's also interesting because the Tua, which is a little country, and we used to call these people country people. I know it sounds like obvious it's in the country, but we would call them country people till very recently. Now, what is called settled. So the country people would have very strong, deep genetic markers themselves, but slightly and only slightly different from some of the Gaelic clans. So as you pointed out, the genetics would say that many of these people have never left their location in century, or generation, whereas travelers may have a much broader genetic markers because no mobility, moving, intermarriages with other clans. Would that
Yeah.
be
Yeah. Yeah, there seems to be some indications of that, all right, yeah. I don't know how fine-grained the studies are. They were just going, I was looking at provinces and stuff, and they were testing people for example, who knew that their grandparents great-grandparents had lived in the same area. So that was just that kind of test. You're testing people there on purpose who haven't moved in a long time to see, what was their genetic makeup, basically. So I don't know how much we can. Genetics, as you know, is finicky. It's dangerous to make assumptions about stuff from it. But we can say that from some groups, they were showing up for people like farmers or people living on the land like that have been in families who've been in areas and know they've been in areas for at least 5 generations, show a pattern where it's distinct between provinces. Not even on a smaller scale than that, but certainly between provinces. You can kind of tell the makeup roughly of them in province. It kind of makes sense. The provinces were like the big countries of Ireland, in a way. The kind of big confederations, weren't they? They had one king.
like nations within themselves?
Yeah, little countries within that, the Tua, that are small countries, but they're conformed into confederations that have one overking. So the major kings in Ireland were all provincial kings. So those were really the kind of functioning territories that had a big unit. One large unit was a province. I mean, we know that going back a long way. So, and they had a king, and they were operational. There was never really a fully operational king of the whole country as such, but the provinces were definitely operational. And you can see that there, where a lot of the populations within the provinces probably weren't crossing the provincial boundary that often, not for marriage anyway. And that's interesting. But I probably haven't answered this guy any question here. The genetics shows two things. The split that we're talking about a lot in the 16th and 17th century, it's when you'd expect it, around the time of Cromwell. And as we would say, that history would point to the fact that that's the clans are breaking down. And even amongst the settled people who haven't, I'm calling them settled people, I shouldn't call them that. The clan structures are breaking down. And even for the people who are country people who don't move very far in general, even for them, they're being isolated, and settlers are coming in and intermarrying with them. So it starts to break the genetics down a bit. They get mixed up with each other, and they start to move towards where they have to go to for the British to administer them. They ended up packed around the forts. They have to settle along road lines. They have to be obvious. Either that or go on the run.
Was there a separation between, say, like the country people in their little tuas and, say, their chieftains, their leaders, their leading?
Spencer, we know they're targeting all levels of society. So our Irish society, Gaelic society, is a complicated society that has a lot of different levels of hierarchy and a lot of different people doing a lot of different jobs, all the way from the provincial level king with his retinues and he's got a province level poet, province level bards.
Spencer is the poet of the 16th century, Edmund Spencer. Is that the guy?
Yeah. Well, so just imagine though, I'm saying that there's a province level administration. You know, the king, they're at Tulsk. We went through it, didn't we?
Yeah.
The king is at Tulsk. We actually saw the two mounds at Tulsk, actually. We saw the castle.
Yeah.
Yeah, outside the pub. And the feud that goes on to this day between them over the stream of the Ogulla stream, which is a kind of remarkable story I'll probably tell one of these days. But the King of Connacht's castle is there. And so you have an administration kind of going on at that level. But then you've got all the layers below that, you know, all the way down to a small territory that has its own little chief and his level of bards and poets and all that. Now, they might just go on a little cycle around that too. They might just be in a small area. That could be just a little part of North Sligo. But you'll have another bunch who are moving over a wider distance that are a level above that. And then if finally you get to the province level where they're moving round and round that province, if you know what I mean. And that's the...
We came up with that in the conversation with the Fanjay Q.
Yeah.
We're talking about, he thought mistakenly that we were deliberately looking for nomads in the Gaelic world. But it wasn't. We were kind of dismissing it because you were very familiar with the Gaelic culture, and you were saying that there was very few people moving around in the first place. It was swampy. It was not very safe. You talk about visual kings, leaders, clans. So basically, the people who had most mobility would have been the warrior class, the bardic class, craftspeople, maybe some religious people, I would imagine. But by far and large, most everybody else didn't move very far at all.
Well, it's the reverse. It's the reverse of how we put it. Like we imagine that an administration has bricks and mortar and stays at a center, and if we want to get something done, we go to it. Okay, so you can reverse that and imagine if like the hospital and the dole office and various other things arrived round to you twice a year. If you know what I mean, all right? Yeah. So that's the Gaelic administration's done like that. It goes on tour. If you know what I mean. And
I remember many years ago, I was young, I was in Mayo, and it was like they used to drive around with the shop in their truck, and they'd come up and they'd park, and when you buy your bits and pieces. And I think sometimes they even do it with libraries. It's like a mobile unit that goes around, that comes around at a fixed time and place. Similar to that, I would imagine.
Exactly. So they would come to an area and hold courts. You could get stuff sorted out. There might be in the retinue to be maybe warriors if something else needed sorting out. There'd be, but there would also be craftspeople. There's fairs, stuff happening, whatever, horse dealing, all kind. It's but it comes to your area every so often, and there's obviously a population within each tour. There's a certain population within the tours that don't move beyond those tours, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
In general. But there's a rake of other people who have rights to move beyond that, and the rights given to you. You can see that that book of Sweeney there, because it was a big deal when they get granted the right of the circuit of.
What book was that?
There's McSweeney's book.
Sorry, I can't tell you.
I'll just mention it. I don't know who they are. Some obscure tribe, right? But in that book about in Tyrconnell, they say it as if it's this big deal, which it is, that they're given the right to the circuit of Tyrconnell, which means they're able to move between different countries, but only in the Tyrconnell, so around that area, if you know what I mean. Not the entire province of Ulster at that point, maybe later, but not initially. And that's under one king, under O'Donnell. And so you can see
that was initially when they arrived here. That was initially, but because they were really good with their sword, everybody liked them soon after, and they could go out of hell wherever they wanted to go, because they popped up in just about every part of the country. Desmond, Cork, the whole lot.
Okay, well, getting back to those names, I was going to say that what's in the genetics as well, though, is it shows that a lot of Irish clans and travellers are showing evidence that their population is not just that it's split in the 16th century, from that settled people are a little bit looking a bit different or whatever. There was a large influx of people from Britain and everything, so that explains all of that. But 1,200 years before that, I think it was, isn't it? Or
Just,
before now.
just before you go there, just to give sort of a context also, this was when colonization was at its heights. Henry VIII, Edmund Spencer, scorched earth, Cromwell with settlements. So there was the deliberate breaking down of a Gaelic order.
So that's the
So
what we call
that's
it.
when, sorry, God.
Yeah, sorry, go on. Yeah.
But
What we call a
so,
split. What we call a split is actually they're physically changing the landscape. Like there's no choice for a lot of people here, and there's many settlers coming in from outside and moving into areas. Soldiers, garrisons are moving into areas, and they're not leaving. You know what I mean? So the forts are being built, which we might mention in a minute.
and even a couple of a couple of centuries prior to that, in the 14th century, which wasn't that long after Henry went ape, is that they had the statues of Kilkenny. So that was like your first logic of apartheid system. So the English and Normans weren't necessarily married into the Gaelic culture. They were trying to forbid it, to trying to stop it. So yeah, the kind
Yeah,
of
okay. Well, I'd be a little careful there in the sense that you're correct. I mean, those laws are there, but we would often use in history, we'd look at laws and say, well, if they have to make a law saying that you're not allowed to marry the local Irish chief's daughter, then they're probably marrying the local Irish chief's daughter. That's why they make the law.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's right. Yeah.
you know. So that was going on. You're not allowed to go to a court, an Irish court. You're not allowed to wear Irish dress, that kind of stuff. But they were trying to fight against the tide, because what was happening was a lot of people were doing that, and that was the problem.
I
Because what
remember
you're
coming across
describing,
something. It was a decolonization of an English university, and there it was brilliant stuff. But at the time, there was the English in England, and they were mocking the English in Dublin, and they were calling them Irish dogs because they had a rough Irish accent. And I thought they must have taken great offence to this. I'm not quite sure. The double check, was it just before the Statute of Kilkenny or afterwards? But it got so bad that Richard II had to intervene, I think, and told them that he would put them in prison and fine them. They're all his lieges and not to be fighting among each other.
yeah.
Um, so there was a definitely strong sense of identity, even as far back then, about being English and what it was to be English, I guess.
Yeah, that's in the English colony, which is there since the 12th century, and which the person in the question asked about, because they're saying that they think there was some split then. My understanding, though, of there isn't a huge change in the country on the scale we're talking about in the 17th century back in the 12th. Not, there's a lot of change, but not that kind of scale, you know.
Mm.
And so I'm not sure. There was a prior one in the 800s when the Vikings had arrived in. Which causes quite a bit of change, but I'm not sure how much it changed. Some genetics, there's signatures show up along the Midlands, along the Shannon, of Vikings and stuff like that. And the probably in various other parts of the country or whatever like that. But what we see, that thing is from 1200 years before the present, where what they're saying is not so much as there's not like this thing where they're saying there's some kind of massive split in the country. What they're saying is that there was that the populations they're looking at, traveler populations, show that they were already limited. They were already limited in their interbreeding, let's say, for that 1,000 years. Okay, in other words, they were already exclusive to each other to some extent. Yeah, and that marker starts at about 1,200 years ago. And the only thing I could come up in history that would make sense for that would be that that's actually the point of the development of those clans that we can see in history. In other words, that's when the names emerge, more or less, is when most of modern Irish clans, all the surnames basically in this country that are Gaelic Irish, we don't see them before. They're a thing that had to develop at some point. And that's roughly the time that they develop. In other words, there could be some form of structure before that. Obviously, people are living in family structures, they're clans of some sort. However, it's around that time that this idea of surname surname. Well, let's put it this way: the surnames that are still with us emerge then, and that means that the dynasties that rose to power about 1,200 years ago, or 1,200 to 1,000 years ago. The O'Connors appeared. The other, various other types of clans appeared. Before that time, it's not clear that the surnames are operating in the same way. There's probably some kind of clans. There's probably some kind of system. I just can't tell you exactly how it operated, but the clans that do emerge, that are still there in the 16th century, they all pop into existence in the 9th, 10th century. Okay, so
Okay.
that would mean that by definition, if they become clans, let's say O'Connors and O'Briens and a few others appear at around 950, say, something like that, right? They're still there 500 years later, and that means that they've, say, like, for reasons of power and dynastic structures, like basically systems of power where people intermarry with each other, and that's how it's done. That means for those 500 years, that's what they've been doing in order to remain at the top or remain in power in the country, if you know what I mean. They've been intermarrying with families of equal power. So the O'Briens would marry into the O'Connors, or that kind of thing, in order to
balance of power,
maintain or increase power in the way it works. Yeah, and so you would get that Connacht dynasties would all be intermarrying with each other, and so would ones in Leinster and ones in Munster. And then when you get to the very, very top, which were knocked out later on, when you get to the very, very top, somewhere in Meath and that, they would be marrying on an international scale almost. Yeah. So those ones might even marry into Normans or other things like that, And so, yeah, but it's all in those days. People don't have an idea of national identity, but they certainly have an idea of powers of clans and the powers of great warrior clans and things like this.
It was based on genealogy.
I would think that
where your people came from, because that was the remonstrance of the Irish chiefs in 1317, I think it was.
Well,
and even there, they were talking about how no foreign blood and all this kind of stuff. I know that's the language at the time.
Yeah.
But there was definitely a lot about family orientated clans, dynasties, that kind of mentality, I suppose.
Yeah, and they're just trying to prove how they're trying to say they're the legitimate people in the country and blah blah. You know what I mean? That kind of stuff. Yeah.
Nothing has changed much when it comes to travelers today.
No.
It's been written out of history, and we have to use DNA to prove that. No, we've been here a long time.
No, but I would suggest that that's what's being picked up in the DNA. And I was going to say one further thing, which is that we actually talked about that with the genetic expert at one stage briefly. It wasn't a great study or anything, but we did have a chat about it with Cavalieri, and it would fit the picture. Genetic, you would get the same signature, that initial signature of somewhat isolated from the general population. You will get that if you're talking about dynastic families. So, for example, if you had big samurai families in Japan, I'm just going to use that as an example, you'll find as you go further up towards the top until they get really weird at the top, like with the emperor who, for example, it leads to extreme examples. And I mean this in the, this is like to do with ancient Egypt or something. An extreme example is where the pharaoh is literally a god. And as a god, he can't marry anyone except his own sister.
Yeah.
Because nobody else is worthy, right?
Gods can marry gods.
Yeah, but gods can only marry gods, exactly. So that's the extreme form of it. And we actually do, weirdly enough, see that possibly in Neolithic Ireland, right? But we're talking thousands of years ago. Now, that was well gone by the time we're talking. But on a much lesser and more kind of normal level, power is still held in families by people intermarrying with families of a similar status, and people still concerned about that even now. And that's what we see. And if Ireland was clan based and power was structured in those ways, then that's what the genetics would pick up. And we suggested that to Cavalieri, and he says, well, yeah, that would explain that. And so there's not a split. What there is the clans are already discernible from about 1,000 years ago. You can already see that they're clans, if that makes sense. And then that travels all the way up to the 17th century. And then what you get is a split where a new kind of way of living comes in called settled way of living, the English way of living. And it becomes the dominant one, and the clans shrink in size so that there's less and less. And actually that just concentrates the problem, because now there's less and less people for them to intermarry with, if you know what I mean. So
Yeah.
yeah, I hope that makes some sense.
Yeah, I think it was always being kind of framed, being up to a certain point, they were trying to convince people were gypsies in Rome and came from North India, which is strange in itself. These are the scholarly type people. But then it was reduced to almost travelers diverged from the settled population. Travelers split from the settled population. The word split, as I mentioned earlier, was mentioned 17 times in that paper, where divergence, I think, was mentioned 3 times. But and it gives this a kind of illusion that we broke away from the settled population, we became the lesser, downtrodden, hanging around the wastelands, and just that kind of nasty, not nasty, but that kind of negative phrasing to it. And of course, even before the microbiome science came along, we weren't buying that in the first place. As you pointed out in archaeology, what settled population? The only settled population you could find was the Dublin, Galway, Limerick, Cork, English, Norman slash town walled settlements. Beyond within that was a
Well,
Gaelic society.
yeah, the problem is it's not logical because if you've most of the traveller families have Irish names or even Norman names that we know lived beyond the Pale, right? So if they're already living in clan structures and then how do they split from, how do they already, yeah, do you know what I mean? You'd have to have Gaelic families, you'd have to have families with Gaelic names that were settled population that for travellers to split from and still have the same names.
I think the bonus one
It's
was the podcast we had with Professor Fergus Shanahan, and we were going through the same stuff about the colonization, the archaeology part of it, the breaking down the clan systems, what might have happened, what could have happened. And it was interesting because he said at one point he said, Dylan, everything that you're saying is what we are seeing in the science, which was one of those big bonuses because up to that point, we never went around using DNA to prove anyone's identity because that's just silly. One is biology, the other is psychology. You know, it's mind, or it means nothing. Like look within the travel community. There's Norman, Old English, Spanish, French. God knows who's in there. Same with the settled people. We're talking about mentalities and cultural identities, and of course, microbiome science comes along, which I kind of frame it as a cultural science because you have to live a certain way, eat a certain way, have to have certain animals around you to have maintain this microbiome in the first place. So that's just reinforced everything that we were trying to convey and trying to say. For me, it was like we're talking about knowledge and healing. That was definitely a good dose of it.
Yeah, I mean, to summarize that would mean that the genetic studies the microbiome confirms that the population is older than when the new way of living came into the country in the 17th century. Okay, that
Yeah,
would confirm that travelers were living in an older fashion way than that. That it was pre-industrial, which means they had to have been there before that. That gets you past that block. The other thing is we see a split, which is actually the origin of the settled people in the 16th and 17th century. That's the origin of that population across the country. Yeah,
that's right.
and then we also see that thing that the person had referenced, which was the fact that there was a certain isolation of travelers or uh, clan structures going back 1,200 years, which is roughly to when those emerged. So really, if you put all that together, it just means that travelers are shown that that the structures, the family structures or clan structures of them are shown that they were already living the way they were at least 1,200 years ago. Yeah,
That's pretty good. As opposed to diverge from the settled population, they became this kind of subculture from the settled population, and so on and so forth. Um, yeah, I mean, well, I don't know how to even convey all this stuff, but we would always believe that some form of artwork, documentaries, films, movies would be great to go through this and put it in a way that is simplified, um, that man, woman, child can understand it. It's like, that makes more sense. As happens when our talks, sometimes more times than often, people say, I always knew that, I always sensed that, believed that. And we're just confirming it because up to this point, even this present moment, the narratives are not correct. The one that the travel organizations have is incorrect. the one the state has is incorrect. And I'm always convinced that if you have the wrong paradigm, the wrong belief system, and you're operating powerful institutions that produces outcomes, this could well be related and connected to a lot of the psychological challenges that travellers are facing. And not just travellers, settled people also in general, west of Ireland as we know it. Because understanding this, even the basic form of it, will understand us why there is no real infrastructure in the west of Ireland, why Donegal might just get 1% of the GDP, why we're not allowed to vote for our own mayor. Simple stuff, but very effective stuff by understanding history as a form of knowledge based medicine, psychological medicine. What do you go for that? We have Vanessa. Good evening, Vanessa. Um, yeah, I'm going to bring it back, and we won't spend too much longer. I did come on tonight to test out this trial run, how would it operate on different platforms. But maybe we'll save most of it for the next night. But there was a fascinating story as to the nomad, Edmund Spencer, Resnullius and Terranullius, and these Roman laws that were used in Ireland to justify conquer and conquest, and the rights of the conqueror over the conquered, and the land, and all these fascinating stuff. But there was one remarkable story we brought up briefly, and if anyone's watching this at any point, please go on to our YouTube channel, type in Electric Picnic 25, settler colonization, because there's a fascinating story in there, and I think we really should give it time, if not tonight, some other time, is Rory O'More. It is, we had, and again, it's on our YouTube channel. A couple of years back, we had an interesting talk with John Malloy in Castlebar, and interesting conversation. I'm not sure exactly how I best handle that one, but I think I irked him just a little bit. But nevertheless, he was under the impression, at least belief system that he had, that Rory Moore was the first traveller. That's perfectly fine. We're okay with that. We don't necessarily believe he was, because the term traveller itself didn't come so much later, anyways. Indeed, nomad and vagrant, vagabond didn't come till English colonization had come to the island. But that's okay. It's a compliment as to how once a man was to where a man is now. So Roy Moore was the king of Leinster, and as you point out, some brilliant stories. How he used to defeat the English on many occasions.
Leash.
And Lee, sorry, Portly, sorry. But how he's the king of Leash, and how he defeated the English on several occasions, and he was no pushover. The English were quite terrified of him. But eventually, all good things come to an end, I guess. The empire wins out, breaks him down, and then hires a painter to come in and draw this image of Rory Moore with a shawl across him. He looked timid and old and weary, and he had a dog next to him, and he was in the woods, and he had a pot and a pan, and so on and so forth. And what you point out was like the first forms of propaganda. It was like to say, here is your great king. Here he is now. Look at him. This is how powerful we are as an empire. And I think it's just a fascinating story. And I'd like to see it actually in a film one day. I think it'd make a great movie, wouldn't it?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, or Malloy would have been correct in the sense that he's both right and wrong, depending on how you look at it. Not the first traveller in the sense of what we're talking about, in the sense of people in clans and all the rest. Not culturally by any means, but he was right in the sense that it's it's this idea of how the state portrays people as a category. The beginning of the state kind of now you can keep going back to other versions, but let's say this beginning of the modern form of it is definitely there that's in the 16th century. The Lord Deputy of Ireland at the time in Dublin was Sir Henry Sidney. This is the 1570s and time we're talking about. Quite a while ago.
By no means is it such an imagination that I ever take that, and no traveller would ever take that as an insult. We would say, yeah, that's obvious. Many of us came from kings and warriors. We've been saying this all along. So yeah, to me, it's like, yeah, put him in there. We'll take a few more like him too.
Yeah, but it's just an example of how one of the examples that people can look into. Maybe it warrants a bit more research, but it's one of a very clear example of like the beginning of this kind of thing where the state is trying to portray people as it's creating a category that is not not just like, oh, here's a guy. They're on purpose not recognizing any status the person has in Gaelic society, because that doesn't matter. That's the point. Gaelic society is targeted for destruction at this point, one way or another. And as you point out, he's one of the 7. They had 7 septs in Laois that I'm aware of, and they were famous enough. But I think the main one was the O'Moores, who were the O'Moria, from which Rory O'More was. They were the, it was semi-elected kind of a status, but they were the kings of Laois. They came from that family. That was the way it worked. And I also believe that,
wasn't it brilliant that the lady who was hosting our talk on settler colonization in Portlaoise happens to have the surname Moore.
yeah, she had the same name.
I thought like, well, the stars are aligning.
Yeah, she had the same name. I also believe they were hereditary, what they call hereditary marshals. A lot of things ran in families in Ireland, obviously, where the clans were, attached to certain things. They had a certain role. Some of them kept the bell, the magic bell of Saint whatever his name was, right? Others were keepers of, the keepers of a church, or others had martial roles, military roles. And from what I understand, the septs in Laois were the marshals, and the O'Moores were the marshals for the kings of Leinster. In other words, they were the ones that were supposed to lead the armies of Leinster, and had done for many centuries, And so I think that's what made them more inclined to be martial, in the sense that they would resist with arms the type of incursions. And in the 1540s, the border between the Pale and, so the Wild West border, essentially, was along the River Barrow, just to east of where we were at the Electric Picnic. There's a river running north-south there called the Barrow, and it was that river was the frontier. The other side of it was Kildare, where you had
that was
the Pale.
Was that the first frontier in Ireland? Probably
Well,
from the English point of perspective.
Not quite the first, but that's the border of the 4 shires. So it's like Lord of the Rings. This stuff.
We know Star Trek was the final frontier in space.
Yeah.
So thereabouts was the beginning of your frontiers.
So this is the first frontier on the Shire, the 4 shire frontier. This is the 4 shires. This one is
the 4 neighbouring counties of Dublin,
that were under the English control.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's castles along the Barrow River at maybe Carlow or Naas place. I'm not quite sure, to be honest. I have to give me geographies all over the place. Anyway, they'd have castles along the edge there, along the border on the River Barrow, and you'd have to you crossing that, you're crossing the boundary into more or less the Pale, but certainly into the 4 shires, which is the outside region of the Pale. It's kind of a mixed region.
Carrickmines one of them?
Yeah, Carrickmines is the second layer, right? So this is like, you have to think.
Oh God, yeah, like at the maze. You get past one section, you're into another section, is it?
You have the 4 shires: the Louth, Meath, Kildare, and Dublin. That's 4, isn't it? Yeah.
I think so.
Can't count either, no?
No, I can't count either. But
Louth, Meath, Kildare, Kildare, and Dublin.
Yeah, there's 4 of them. No, Dublin wasn't one of the shires. No, sorry, you're talking about the shires.
Yes.
Was Cavan not one of them?
No. Right, I'm going to stop you there. I'm just going to say it. There was 4. That's the 4 shires, right? So the inner one, you've got an outer boundary around the 4 shires, and within those, the shire just means county in English. So within those counties, you've got an English administration. But this is kind of the mixed frontier. So you've got settler towns, you've got a lot of castles, and you've got a mixed population could be a lot of Irish Gaelic people living there as well. Yeah. But the lords there, the medieval lords and others, are all Anglo-Irish or Old English lords, right? Who arrived in the 12th century. So you've got Baltinglass and the Earls of Kildare, that kind of people. Yeah. It'd be semi-Irish speaking and all the rest. It's an interesting kind of a zone. But they'd also have sheriffs and posse. So if you're into Wild West movies, you're going to understand this, right? This is the area where in the 4 shires is the area where there's a sheriff. He has a posse. Raids come in from the local Indians, which is the Irish, who come from outside. They steal your cattle and try to run away again, and the sheriff goes after them. And there's little villages that contain English settlers in them. Basically, this is the rough outline of it. And so the border at this point in the 1540s is on the Barrow River, and west of the Barrow River is, from the point of view of the English, is Indian country, if you want to think about it like a cowboy movie. And there isn't any of these villages in the way that they understand it. There's no, the castles are all different. The layout of the land is completely different. It's all forested in a different way. There's ring forts. It's a whole different world. And that's run by the Seven Septs of Laois by the O'Moores. And so they crossed the boundary in the 1540s. And the first place they do in two areas, one is up in Offaly, I think, and the second one is in Laois, which they decide they're going to make another county there in Laois. And this county is called Queen's County. And the first thing they do is build a fort there called Fort Protector, which is the very first the first fort of the British Empire to be built. Fort Protector, yeah.
It's quite a cool name.
Yeah, I think it's named after the Lord Protector at the time. The King of England was too young or something like that to be the king, if you know what I mean. So they have a protector, and he administers the state on right. So they created this fort called Fort Protector. But Fort Protector is a new type of fort. It's not like a castle. It was a square fort, and it had rows of houses or barracks inside it, and it was modelled, of course, square fort was modelled on Roman fort. And the idea was that this was a fort.
Big, the Roman movies, and all the armies are in squares.
Yeah.
Something like that you're saying, is it?
Yeah, exactly. Like the army just sat down and so they built this thing that had rows of houses or barracks inside it. It's not a castle for a lord.
It makes sense because you're pointing out that even Ibn and Spencer are not taken off rails or anything, but all these guys were modelling a lot of the colonization and conquest on Roman laws in the first place.
So this is the beginning of the modeling of physically operating, not like in the old medieval days where they were going around building castles and intermarrying with even with Irish clans. This is different project. In this project, they're going to be the empire. Gotcha. So they're modeling themselves on the only empire they know, which is Rome. And they know that in Rome you had to have square forts because everything was measured in square, and the army was all organized in that manner. So what they're trying to do is build a machine. What I mean by a machine is the machine of the state, like the Romans had, a very efficient state that was built out of a very efficient army. And that army used to march every day and build a regular camp. It was always the same. It was all rules, all laws that governed this. And so they would camp every night, and the forts they built were always the same layout. You know, it was all regulated. And so the English are trying to create this instead of like general chaos where everyone just does what they want.
Yeah, organized.
Yeah, they're trying to organize it. So they build this camp, this Fort Protector. And Fort Protector becomes later on Portlaoise. It's what we call Portlaoise. But at the heart of Portlaoise, as you know, we saw it, is actually the walls of this fort. It's still in there in the middle of it, if you know what I mean. But it's a very important fort because it's the very first fort. Like everyone, as I said about cowboy movies, when you see the cowboy movies now, and it's about the Indian Wars or whatever, you'll see the cavalry coming out of the local fort. Might be made of timber in the Wild West. Here it was made of stone. But those forts, those little square forts that you get in the Wild West, they're the descendant of this fort because this is the first one.
Like Fort James, Fort Williams, like Jamestown.
Fort Knox.
Fort Knox. Yeah, they're all modelled on the forts.
They're all descended from this one. They're all descended from this one. Gotcha. Every one of them. Yeah. This is the very first one the British built. This and Fort Governor, that's to the north of it, which becomes whatever the county town of Offaly is, which I always forget. Sorry about that. But that's so this one becomes Portlaoise. So it's a very important fort, yeah. And they're consciously imitating Roman law. And one of the ideas behind that as well is what you said, which do you want me to talk about that? Or
yeah, not? Please go ahead. Yeah.
They also are making things legal. They're building a state kind of an operating system. If anyone's into computers, like a kind of system of laws that operate how these things are going to be done. And they're copying the Roman law. And in the Roman law, they have a law called the res nullius, which is like the law that makes it legal to take land or to take. Initially, it's not land, but to take possession of artifacts or objects or whatever. That if nobody owns them, basically, if they can say no one owns it, then you can take it, essentially. But
remember initially the hedgerows, and I don't know if we believed it or not, or I was believing it in my own head. It was like a way of breaking down the Gaelic culture for stopping them moving. but it's also now, it could well be also this is marking out their new territories.
Yeah. So the
Marking,
Roman law actually says that if a land is not, if it's not fortified and it's not defensible, then it's res nullius and it can be seized. It doesn't belong to anyone.
gotcha.
Okay. So then you can come in and take it. And it's legal for you to take it. So what happens is they're using the Roman law to excuse what they're doing, essentially. But they think that anything that's in Roman law must be legal, because Rome to them is like some fantasy,
Godlike temple.
godlike origin story that they've only just rediscovered. Right? They can't understand how they had an empire that big. They want to be that big, but they don't understand how it was done. Really, they're admiring it like some kind of alien civilization from the past that had superior technology. Okay.
Gotcha.
And so what they're doing is following Roman law, even if they don't quite understand the Roman law. It turns out Roman law didn't actually apply to land when it came to that, but that doesn't matter to the English because they're trying to copy it anyway, and they apply it to land. So the Roman law also had a law that, like, if you take possession of wild beasts and birds and sea and fish and all that kind of stuff, that if you could capture them, then you owned them. That was the law. Very simple, really. These were simple kind of laws. But and the other one, like I said, was the res nullius, which was that you could, if the land wasn't enclosed, if it wasn't enclosed and it didn't have any fortifications or couldn't be defended. Now, this is from the English point of view.
Yeah, I was going to say that they're modeling that on the English perspective of what land should look like, how it should be cultivated, what a house should look like, and if it didn't look like any of theirs, it's up for grabs.
Yeah, exactly. And then the third part of it is that they would that people hadn't permanent dwellings if they were nomads. Then by definition they hadn't enclosed the land and didn't own it. They were like wild animals, like I said, and wild animals could be put aside or could become the owner. You could own them.
It would be classified as wild animals. It wouldn't be.
And you could own them if you discover them first, type of thing. Okay, so that would justify it if people were like wild animals. And so what do we see during the 16th and 17th century? Because these are the laws, what happens is that people moving in, even when the state doesn't ask them to do it, they're just doing it anyway, because they might find themselves they might have guns, they might find themselves in a position, they might be having a fight with the local Gaelic clan, they decide they're going to go in and take the land or whatever. So they're crossing the Barrow River and moving into these areas, and what they're doing is they have to prove that it fits Roman law. So even if there is a defensive Gaelic stronghold, they'll demolish that and say there's no enclosure, there's no defenses here. If the land is open, they'll start building. They'll start trying to enclose it. So they'll start planting, these hedgerows you're talking about and things like this. If they enclose it, they can say, we enclosed it first in the English fashion, therefore we own it under the Roman law. And what they'd also do is push say, for example, clans were inhabiting those areas. Now, Irish clans might move around a little bit more. They might go up the mountains in the summer. They might do whatever. The English would move in while they're missing, build something, whatever it is, and then declare it to be legally theirs, if you know what I mean. And then the fights would begin, if you know what I mean.
My God, they've been doing that to travellers even very recently. Once the traveller moved away for the summer, they'd move in with boulders and stakes, so they couldn't move back again, and then claim it as whatever. And is it the time similar? Obviously, it's modelled on the same one. If the forts are modelled here, and we know that colonization was exported to America. Remember the gentleman we came across, Mark Charles? So he was talking about very much the same thing, the so-called discovery.
Yes, law of discovery. Yeah. Which I'm not sure. It's the same. It's coming from the same idea. It's maybe a slightly later version of the same thing, where they're trying to legalize possession of land in different ways. But actually, it's really just playing games with them.
Well, the English did at that stage, also because they're modelling their laws and the rules on the old Empire of Rome, that they had to be civilized about it. They couldn't be just brutes.
So this was the other idea of Rome, of course, was Rome had two, Romans and Greek civilization had this concept. There was civilization, which was what they lived in, and then there's barbarians and nomads that lived outside that, and that's the concept the English also developed, which is that beyond the pale is wild Irish. That's why the Irish become wild Irish, if you know what I mean, and they're the civil, and there's the civil Irish within it, or the civil world, which is the ones that live in towns and cities. were civilized. And so you live in a fort or town, you're civilized. If you live outside that, you're wild. Now, this served a purpose, because once you're wild, it means you're sort of equivalent to the wild beasts. And that means that you can either be pushed aside, or someone kind of owns you, because but you don't own the land. That's for sure. So you'll see
everything had to be contrasted. In other words, if
Mm.
we're civil, there has to be someone who's uncivilized. If
Yeah.
we are, whatever, civil, somebody has to be savage. Or so.
Yeah, so it's the beginning of concepts of that, because before that, and this is what he was saying about the first traveler, for example, there's no concept before that in Irish society of like someone's civil and someone's wild, there isn't those binary contrasts going on, because they don't exist. Why would there? Why would they? There's other things going on, but not that, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
There's not this idea that the state does this or whatever. This is very much the machinery of the state, which is based on these systems of documents. And you've got clerks sitting in offices stamping the document, and someone is sending a letter back in from Laois or wherever, and I'm saying, if I'm an English soldier or adventurer of some sort, and I've been given a grant or something, but actually the O'Moores already live there, or some clan like this. So what ends up happening is they have to make what they're doing has to conform to what the clerk back in the office is rubber stamping, if you know what I mean. So what they'll do is, if there's a castle that's an Irish castle there, well, that would be a problem, because that would mean that the Irish had already defended it. So what you need to do is get rid of that. So they'll demolish the castle, then they'll build their own castle, or enclose land in some way, and then say, well, we did it first. There's no sign of any Irish around here. And also they'll classify the Irish then as either wild Irish or uncivilized or barbarians or whatever it fits the Roman law, and then declare that they're nomads as well in particular. Nomads
to retain.
Nomads by definition don't enclose land, don't farm it, and don't defend it in that way. They move around on it. That's the point. That's the Roman
idea. This would uphold their machine as being civil.
And that means that everything they're doing then becomes legal to the guy back in the office. He goes, well, look, it says here that they were just wild. They weren't doing anything. They weren't enclosing anything. They weren't farming properly. They were just nomads. So that's fair enough. And they rubber stamp the form that says that land is now yours to this whoever the English guy is. Now, if he can defend it against the clans, then that's it. He's got the legal document that says that's now his according to the state. And so this process,
you referred to it earlier on as like a machine, an operating system, and of course, then this has to be the code and the code of law. So they go out and say, to tick the boxes, they're uncivilized, they're beastly, they're savages, they're unruly. This gives us the right to take what's not ours.
Yeah, so you see, one of the reasons to explain this is to make it clear to people that it's not even when you read about these terrible things in the 16th, 17th century where they're calling people, it seems like they're just calling them names all the time. But actually, they might be doing that a little bit, but really what they're concerned about is to make it what they're doing legal. Because if they compare the wild Irish to beasts, then it's legal what they're doing when they take the land. So they're really concerned about making it legal. They might know well that they're not beasts. They might even know them. Yeah. But it doesn't matter.
That's quite fascinating, because I mean, that literally is what they did in the 1960s with the so-called labeling of people itinerants, and then said they were this, that, and the other. They were uneducated, they were troublesome, they were scaring people. We need to educate them, assimilate them, and help them into society, and retaining their whole, we're the civilized people, they're not. Exact same thing. Well,
because the concepts would be, it's a more, they're trying to be nice kind of version of it, but it's the same concept behind it, that there's wild and civil, and and there's two are contrasted. Some people are just outside of it. I would suggest that it goes right back to that point, because that's exactly what they had to do then to make, when the state itself, and that's the important thing. The most important thing about it is it's the state documents that declare that things are only legal if it conforms to Roman law. So you operating on the land, if it's res nullius, if the land isn't owned by someone, then you can take it. That's legal. But you have to prove it's not owned by someone. And how do you do that? You declare them all to be nomads. Yeah. And so you have to, and one of the ways to do that is to actually make them more nomadic than they already are. For example, if they have a castle and they have a place to live and all that, destroy it, push them into the boglands and across to the side of the roads, and then say they're nomads. And
I can
then
see a lot of similarities between how
yeah,
even, and then that's not to berate or anything or to attack, but how even goodwill, good, nice, polite, kind people access state funding when it comes to travelers. We have to fit a certain criteria, and we end up being we tick the boxes. So if it's for HSC funding, we've got mental health issues. Let's access the machine. If it's to do with the local authorities, we're homeless. Access the machines. But it's almost yeah. I don't. I haven't thought out a lot, but there's definitely a lot of similarities.
yeah, it's bureaucracy. That's what we're talking about. Where it's all everything has to conform to whatever's on the office, whatever the categories that the office is dealing with, basically, isn't it? That's how it works. And so yeah, yeah, and that's why we end up in those days with a really crazy situation where it's not legal unless you destroy people's houses and put them on and push them out of the side of the road. If you just left them there and moved in and opened a sweet shop yourself, for example, I'm giving a stupid example, but you know what I mean.
Yeah,
In
yeah.
theory, in theory, English could have moved into areas and opened an English type of business or something, right? And it could have worked with the clans, right? I know it's being idealistic, but this is possible. And in some cases, it could have happened. Or in some cases, it did happen occasionally. Guys would come in and they'd build a bridge or
So
do mining.
was that in the Roman Empire? Was that wasn't their model? So if they were using that, they had to go by what the machine does.
Yeah, that becomes impossible. That kind of cooperation becomes impossible for the peaceful settlement things. Becomes impossible because it has to conform to the concepts that are in the Roman system. And so now it's not legal for you. It's not legal for you to own land there if you just go in and leave the natives there. Now you have to go in and make sure they're all nomadic. Make
Do you
sure there's
remember?
no enclosure.
Do you remember? And we're bringing Star Trek up a few times tonight, the Final Frontier. But the episode you were telling me about, I went away and watched it. I had seen it years ago, and I think it's in season. I'm guessing now, season 3, episode 2. I think it is, and it's called Nomad. And it was about this system that was created on Earth to go out into space and seek out new life. I think was it, and to report back. But it clashes with this alien space, alien intelligent species, and it gets all muddled up. And now it's setting to seek out new life, but to sterilize it. And if it's not perfect, it will eliminate it. That's what we're talking about, the English colonial Roman system.
Yeah, I would say that it operated in that fashion because
Oh yeah, and what was then you're telling me is that the machine, even the one on Earth, was invented by a guy called Kirk.
yeah,
Um, so in the episode when Captain James T. Kirk's name is mentioned, the Nomad machine believes this was its creator,
yeah,
but it proves that even the machine has flaws because James T. Kirk wasn't the creator. So
yeah,
it gets to kind of fall back in itself. And
yeah,
the whole I don't know, this is strange, but why we're here. But when it came to travelers, that we were the inferior, we were the imperfect, we needed to be assimilated, and
yes.
now we're saying to the machine, how could that be possible if our poo poo is healthier than you? Who no, fall back in yourself. It doesn't make sense. Our shit is worth millions, billions on a
Remember,
global scale.
you remember in that episode, the probe ends up destroying itself because it realizes it made a
Self
mistake.
destructs, yeah, because
It made a mistake, and
it's
therefore,
flawed.
yeah, and therefore it can't be perfect, and therefore it has to self-destruct itself. It has to sterilize itself. So that's how it works. Yeah,
It's a strange one, and I know that we're comparing Star Trek and the Irish State, but then again, it's called the Final Frontier, and they talk about colony, they talk about colonizations. So the mentality the scriptwriters had in mind colonization, so it didn't come from nowhere.
well, states are the beginning of machine. It's a machine. It's operating like a machine. People have there's a system. There's a system of procedures that has to be done. It can't do it. You can't do it any other way unless someone changes the program. You know what I mean? And so those programs just run for years and years. If unless people actively change them, that's what it is.
Oh, you think about it too, Dylan, I'm sure it will come to mind for a lot of people, is that all the protesting and lobbying, the campaign, would it be women's rights, women voting, would it be on abortion, equality, LGBT marriages, whatever it might be, all of them came with great struggle to get to the point where they turn around and go, okay, make a new law. And then when they do it, they celebrate it. We're the first country to recognize this, we're the first country to do this. But up to that point, it's almost impossible to change the machine. and it comes at great cost, including life.
Yeah.
But when it's done, yeah, wow, why didn't we do it before?
Yeah. Yep. There you go. That's one good reason to that it's not negative to look at how systems came to be in the past, because if you understand how it came, you understand how they built the engine, then you can change the engine.
Oh, we're doing full circle here back to that lady, and if people go on to the video, not in personal against her, I'm obviously not. There's still a fair, just question. There's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
As I mentioned, like a nervous reaction because people get scared sometimes with the things we're saying, because they are in the present, but yet they're also historical. So how can they be in two places at the same time? And we would point out it's because the machine was never switched off. And when we talk about tweaking it, it's like we need to change the code. We're not talking about frying it or getting it to self-destruct and create a Mad Max situation where we all start over again. Slight as it tweaks. Some people get scared by that. And of course, if it's going good for you, and if you're in the system and you're in the institution, why would you want to change it? And that's the big part of it. So that lady asked a question. Actually, before she asked a question, it wasn't even a question, a suggestion maybe. She would also say, well, what about the positives? And it automatically, no, like I said, it went over my head. I didn't take heed of it. You picked up on it. So if we were talking, it was seen, it was meant to be projected that we're talking about a negative, which isn't a negative. It sounds negative. It sounds a bit all sorts. But the idea would be to understand the machine, the operating system, the codes that function it, and rewrite them and tweak it. Like Jared Hogan, Supreme Court judge ruler, changed the concept and the idea that was also in the Constitution, but broadened it, which is what you're saying, broaden the understandings. That home in a Gaelic world doesn't necessarily mean home in the machine, in the English Roman one. But if I tweak it, now we can broaden it. Home could have two different meanings, not just one.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. There you go.
Okay. Yeah, we've been an hour and a half on. This is our first live back in a while for a while. I would believe it or not, I just come on to test out this new operating system, this new machine. But we can tweak it, we can change it. We are in control. But yeah, I hope people have enjoyed it, and we'll come back and we'll see if we can get next time. I will be on TikTok, and TikTok, I should say, and several other platforms, because lots of people have lots of questions, and me and you bouncing off each other is brilliant. It's good to get the conversation going, but it's always nice to get people engaged, and there's so much to talk about. But I would say this one last thing, and I'll hand back to you, is that we don't romanticize history. We're not doing this because we want to go back to a time when it was once great in our history. The further you go back, not that long at all, but the further you go back, you lose your modern technology, you lose your medicines, you have a shorter life expectancy. You don't want to go back. It's here in the present we want to live, but we have to tweak the machines going forward and not allow them to be hijacked by people claiming all crazy kind of stuff. Says the guy who sounds crazy at times, talk about history and indigeneity and First Natives. We have good cause and reason to claim it because we're outside the pale. And we've maintained that narrative through generations. People being fearful of migrants and foreigners and protecting the flag and being patriotic, all that to me is trauma effect. If you didn't recognize Travers for the last 100 years getting brutalized by the same machines, and you believed all them systems were Irish, that's a false narrative. It's a false belief. And I think we have a long way to go, but hopefully one day we get there, that this is about the present and the future, not about the past. With that, I have to figure out how to turn this thing off. But I'm not that familiar with it. Dylan, thank you very much for your time. It's always greatly appreciated. And we'll talk very soon, my friend. And thanks to those who have maintained your presence. And we hope there's something in this you've picked up and not be traumatized. If you feel traumatized, please contact Pappy Point. They're doing mental health programs and de-traumatization. With that, take care, keep well, goodbye.